You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 3, Kidnapping, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 5, Class. Nothing so ruined the celebratory mood of the first day back on Avalon like it being followed by the first day of school. The children couldn't be allowed excessive time to explore the wonders of the magical island or share in one another's company without the burdens of homework and the constant threat of failure. They might do something dangerous and irresponsible like oversleeping, going for strolls, or otherwise enjoying themselves. The weather shared the students' feelings, sobbing openly in sympathy for their loss of freedom as they marched solemnly across the island. It started as an icy November rain for the lodgers, steady, half-frozen droplets streaming sideways and slashing at their exposed skin. They pressed through it, a phalanx of umbrellas, until they reached summer, where the piercing cold was replaced by the pounding fury that only an August storm could bring. Thunder crashed like the ending of worlds, as buffeting winds assaulted them from all sides, breaking their formation and leaving each to fend for themselves against the onslaught. As they battled on into spring, the battering winds slackened, and the rains shifted into an unrelenting vertical April downpour. The march was not without casualties. More than a few umbrellas were lost in the summer gusts or mangled beyond recognition. Fresh new notebooks were soggy masses, ruined before any pen had touched their clean white pages. Brand new shoes of finely polished leather were soaked through, and carefully planned first-day hair and makeup were ruined by the weather. For once, the lodgers hadn't had the worst of it. Wertheim residents arrived at school caked in snow, and a rescue mission was launched to find some first-years who had gotten disoriented in the blizzard. As students slumped over the threshold of the junior high, Principal McCutcheon relinquished her usual duty of judging the length of kilts and quality of knots on ties, instead drying each student with a snap of her fingers as they passed. Kuro's entry gave her pause, as was traditional. He was not wet, at least not like the other students. He did not own an umbrella or raincoat, and in previous years he had avoided the rain by trying to outrun it. It didn't work, of course, but at least he had spent less time in the rain than others. Under the effects of the anchor, the run had been slower and more tiring. But he had convinced the wind to help by blowing away from him in all directions. She sheltered him from the rain as he splashed through the rivers and puddles in his waterproof sneakers. She had little concern, however, for her impact on anyone other than Kuro. That was becoming a growing problem. Ever since the incident with the bog sloth, the west wind had been constantly trying to get her eddies around Kuro properly again, to push and lift and play with him as she had done for years before. She tried every angle and velocity, constantly shifting and swirling in an attempt to find some gap in the anchor's defenses. If requested, she would blow in any direction until she became frustrated at her inability to affect him, then start to gust about even harder. Kuro had adapted to it, but the first night in residence showed him that it was going to be a struggle for others as well. They weren't even asleep yet when a frustrated whirlwind had stolen Arthur's bed covers, and Kuro had to go hunting in the night for good stones with which to weigh down his sheets. Arthur was remarkably gracious about it. It took a good friend to readily accept that no unattended piece of paper or loose piece of laundry would be safe in Kuro's presence. The first real incident had happened at breakfast, when one of his Saskatoon berry pancakes caught too strong a gust and ended up in Sean Cassidy's lap. The second had been on his run to school when a blast of wind in the wrong direction had pulled Magnus Singh's umbrella from his hands. Kuro had foolishly leaped forward to catch it. He succeeded in getting hold of it, and that quickly turned out to be a terrible mistake. While the west wind could not move Kuro, she was extremely capable of moving an umbrella. In the tug-of-war between it and the magic of his bracelet, he had been the loser. He was yanked off his feet and landed face first in the mud. That was the state in which Ms. McCutcheon found Kuro as he crossed the threshold into her school, painted head to toe in mud. The front of his shirt, cardigan, slacks, and face a uniform shade of brown. The principal was unreadable at the best of times, And on the first day of school, when she had to remind students of her unimpeachable authority, she appeared carved from stone. She stood with the posture of a poplar, clad in a heavy dark wool jacket and skirts which made it seem that she was welcoming the students to a funeral rather than school. Her dark, gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a tight and orderly bun so that no hint of her judging glances could be obstructed by a wayward lock. As each student passed, she both dried them and addressed them by name in their native tongue. It was less a greeting and helpful gesture, and more of a demonstration of her power and a reminder that she knew each student better than they did themselves. Bienvenue, Veronique Archambault. Willkommen, Leif Iverson. Falche me votara. Kuro? In the brief silence preceding his name, he could hear the dozen questions that went unasked. What happened? How did this happen? Are you injured? Is anyone else injured? Did you do this on purpose? Why do you insist on making my life difficult? And the loudest of them, why is it always you? Kuro shrugged as both his defense and apology, and she waved him aside, making him wait until she was finished with the other students and could deal with him. When the last of the children who were merely soggy had passed, she returned her attention to the filthy mess that was Kuro and increasingly the floor around him. I presume you haven't mastered the spells necessary to clean this yourself. It was generous of her to ask, but of course Kuro couldn't perform laundering charms. He hadn't even learned them in school, and any attempt he could imagine would likely result in his clothes being torn from his body and a reasonable portion of the school foyer being destroyed in the process. He shook his head. If you would allow me, then, she asked. Kuro nodded, and she quietly muttered an invocation, coupled with a complex series of gestures, which lifted the grime from his clothes and left them more clean and pressed than they had been when he had put them on that morning. Thanks, he said. Ms. McCutcheon did not acknowledge his gratitude. Instead, she waved him off to his first class, for which he was already late. It took precisely 10 minutes for Kuro's continual whirlwind to be recognized as a problem. The moment textbooks were distributed in Gaelic class, the pages at the desk all around him started flipping uncontrollably in the wind. He was exiled to the hallway for misbehaving. A similar punishment was given in numerology class, as his breeze stirred the piles of chalk dust created by the endless equations and diagrams Mrs. Lovelace drew. After her third sneezing fit, she too threw Kuro out of the room. It would have been sooner, but she refused to finish sneezing on a number outside the Pingala sequence, and so kept him until she'd reached an even 13. Mr. Oganov was not as quick to expel Kuro for the disruption, even though it interrupted his dramatic introduction to the evocations work they'd be doing that year. Rather than getting upset at the air currents sweeping away his elegant smoke sculpture of a grand soaring eagle, he stopped mid-conjuring, still standing on one foot with hands outstretched, as if grappling with an unseen opponent, and watched his beautiful works swirl away as if he'd never seen anything so fascinating. "Where's that coming from?" he asked the class. He noted the way the wind in the entirely sealed room was tugging at his cape, and used the pointed tufts of hair on either side of his head like antennae to trace the invading air currents. Every finger in the room pointed to Kuro, including his own. Sighing, he climbed out of his chair, resigned to his fate as a permanent hall decoration. The response from Oganov was not what he expected, though. Rather than accusations of mischief or demands to stop, the teacher asked, how? That was an impossible question. Kuro had no idea how it worked. It just happened. What he did understand was nonsense learned from a talking coyote. No teacher would believe that the prevailing winds had a crush on him and that she was upset that the Royal Guard had bound him with an anchor which kept her from holding him. That was the kind of story Charlie told, not real life. I don't know, Kuro muttered. I can't make it stop. Kuro had a fraught relationship with Oganov and evocations. For 2 years, Kuro had tried his very best, and for 2 years, that had resulted only in frustration and disaster. He was uniquely and invariably incompetent. It was regarded as a successful class when neither he nor anything in the room came out of it damaged. Despite that, Oganov continued to encourage Kuro to try again. He could no more teach Kuro to shape water or mold stone than he could teach a snake to play accordion, but Kuro never doubted his sincerity. The ticking of the classroom clock seemed to drive recalculations within Oganov as he stood motionless, considering Kuro's claims. Then, quite suddenly, as if he were a wind-up toy whose key had just been released, he sprang back into action with full bluster and gusto. "Who recalls what I said about the foundations of magic on your very first day at Avalon?" he boomed. A distinct sound is created by a room full of students asked to recall something unprepared. A rapid shuffling of papers and indistinct murmurings that accuse their notes of betrayal for having lost that important information. That sound is made all the more comical when students are searching blank new notebooks for words they'd failed to record 2 years prior. Nobody, naturally. What kind of teacher would I be if my students remembered what I said? He laughed uproariously at his own wit. Perhaps then you can remember the maximum safe wind speed from a fan. The response from the class was a strained groan, as they collectively recalled the pages of mind-numbing calculations they had done to work out that number, but not the value itself. 94.8 feet per second, Oganov informed his students, rescuing them from the tortured visit to their own minds. And why is it so slow? He did not wait for them to answer this time. Because it starts to get ideas if it gets much faster. The foundation, the very core of magical practice, is the interplay between thought and energy via magical fields. We utilize our thoughts to evoke effects like heat and motion, and even changes in matter. But that is a two-way street. Any matter imbued with too much energy begins generating thoughts. Not complex reasoning like we do, of course. Simple, noisy, messy things. He retrieved a fan from a closet and fixed it firmly onto his desk. With an impressive display of focus, he started to make it spin while continuing to speak. However, as we've established in previous years, thoughts can manipulate energy and matter, creating the potential for a vicious cycle. The fan spun faster and faster until Oganov had to shout over the noise it made. The turbulent nature of the strong wind makes it particularly susceptible to these effects. Every eddy is another opportunity for an idea, and every idea could manifest in something physical. As he said those last words, his fan began to illustrate what he meant. First, a few small droplets of water formed and were pulled along in the strong wind. Then a pebble, followed by a feather, a twig, and a stream of sparks. And then a fully formed egg, which splattered against the side of the classroom. I'd better stop before we conjure a dragon by mistake, Oganov said as he let the fan spin down. Is that possible? Shouted Charlie. Thank you, Ms. Cook, for reminding the class to raise their hands if they have a question, he said with a wink to the room. And yes, it is technically possible. There is a theory that all life was first formed in a particularly imaginative hurricane. However, it's unfathomably unlikely. That egg, for example, he gestured to the mess of yolk dripping down the classroom wall, is certainly not a real egg. It is merely a strong wind's idea of an egg. It has the shape, color, and texture, but no bird could hatch from it. Were we to inspect it closely, we would likely find that it is a toxic soup. Speaking of which, he paused to conjure some cleaning supplies and dispose of the mess he'd created. This combination of properties makes air all but impossible to control directly. The moment it starts to move, any thoughts we pour into it get scrambled. It also means that if a bit of air gets a persistent idea, for example, to follow a student around and disrupt evocations demonstrations, it can be very difficult to change its mind, as it has none to change. Eventually, something will disrupt it, but for the moment, we should consider it an interesting and instructive phenomenon, and politely ask the affected classmate to move his desk far enough from others so as to not blow away their papers. Kuro considered that a very generous, though entirely incorrect, interpretation of his predicament. He dragged his desk to a corner, pulled a few stones from his bag to hold down his notebook, and class continued as if all were normal. Following lunch, word appeared to have spread to the other teachers. A desk had been prepared for him far from other students, and he noted that several of the posters in the hallways with scholastic affirmations and safety policies had been affixed more firmly than normal. It was like the school, as a whole, had learned to deal with his endless strangeness. Given a couple hours to adapt, it could work out how to go back to ignoring him, which suited Kuro quite well. He was just settling into the comfortable routine of isolation and academic incompetence when his world was yet again upended, this time by the appearance of a new teacher. The class had braced themselves emotionally for another year in spellcraft under the tyranny of Ms. McCutcheon, but rather than the timely entrance of the principal at the sound of the bell, a man sauntered in a couple minutes after. He wasn't particularly young, but he seemed youthful, with a boyish face, a splash of freckles, and a hint of a royal jawline. His hair was too long and voluminous for a teacher, and his chin hadn't been shaved in a couple days at least. He had the look of someone who either put no effort into his appearance or put a great deal of effort into looking as though he hadn't. Given the smooth shine on his flowing mane, Kuro suspected the latter. He tossed his tartan blazer over the back of the teacher's chair and sat on the edge of the desk. As he rolled his shirt sleeves up to his elbows, he began to explain his presence. "I am Mr. Pendragon," he said in a lilting Western Tiernogian accent. "I usually teach the high school enchanting classes, but Principal McCutcheon asked me to work with you this term, give you a taste of what's to come after you graduate and all that." He shared a charming smile and a conspiratorial wink with the class, then leaned back over his desk to pull out a sheaf of paper from a drawer. "So let's start off by finding out what you know." The papers individually peeled off the stack and flew through the room until one was hovering over each student's desk. 100 multiple choice questions. Please use a pen to write your answers. You have 45 minutes. You may begin now. He said it as though he had given them a special treat, and the pages slamming down in front of the students were trays of cookies and not a lengthy test. The test, beyond being a cruel way to start a year, was very confusing. Kuro knew his spellcraft well, at least the written parts of it. Being totally unable to cast any of the spells, he'd needed excellent grades on the written work to pass. This test, though, made him doubt that he had ever attended. Half the questions were about things he'd never heard of, there were words he'd never seen, and one of the incantations they were supposed to analyze was in a language he didn't recognize. Pendragon paced the aisles between the desk with his hands in his pockets and a light rhythm to his step as the students wrote in silence. He seemed to be enjoying the misery he was inflicting. Whenever he made the detour past Kuro's desk, the teacher lost his tempo, falling out of time with the ticking of the clock. Kuro tried to keep his eyes on his work and not lose focus, but one time he couldn't help but glance up. When he did, he found Pendragon looking at his work with a curiosity that verged on hunger. Kuro was nowhere near finished when the time ran out. More time would not have helped terribly, however, unless enough had been given for him to derive entire fields of magical study on his own from first principles. Given the anguished groans and hollow stares of his classmates, he was not alone. "Time's up! Pens down!" Pendragon went back to leaning on his desk and smiling, nourished by the pained sounds of his students. "Now, let's get to learning, shall we?" The teacher moved to the chalkboard without appearing to take any further interest in the papers they had just spent most of the period wrestling with. "Aren't you going to collect the tests?" asked Magnus Singh. Pendragon paused, chalk pressed against the board, ready to start delivering a lesson. He turned just his head towards the class with a look of confusion, though his performance was betrayed by a smirk. "Now why would I do that?" While he was clearly toying with them, it was not at all clear why. So Magnus continued, "Don't you need to grade them?" The teacher looked insulted at the suggestion. "I most certainly do not. What sort of third-rate enchanter do you take me for?" He didn't really seem like any enchanter Kuro knew of. The few he'd encountered rarely left their workbenches and had hunched backs from peering at intricate runes. Pendragon seemed more like a street performer, like one of the strays who did Blandland's sleight of hand tricks to entertain and beguile wizards. To a casual observer, they appeared full of spontaneous humor and natural charm, though that was just part of the act, used to distract onlookers while they slid a playing card out of a pocket or palmed a coin. Kuro had seen some of the acts dozens of times, learning their sleight of hand and taking advantage of the performance to slide some things from the pockets of captivated audience members. Pendragon had the same showmanship. The pause after feigning offense built tension and kept focus on him. Kuro could have snapped his fingers in time with the release. "They'll grade themselves," said the teacher as he redirected the students' attention back to the papers on their tables with a sweep of his hand. Green checkmarks and red X's drew themselves onto the pages at a carefully measured pace, creating a rhythm of gasps, groans, and cheers. Listening to the similarity in reactions and relief as the last few questions came up as correct for nearly everyone made it seem like the whole thing had been designed to manipulate the students. The test was too hard to do well on and too easy to fail, but set up so they were left guessing until the last few grades filled themselves in. Just as the papers finished their performance, Pendragon stepped back in to deliver the final applause line. "Of course, these won't be counted towards your final grade." A pause just long enough for the high achievers to gasp with relief and the rest to build some anger, then a smirk, followed by a self-deprecating joke. "I might be a teacher, but I'm not a monster." Kuro almost expected him to present a hat for them to throw money into. Instead, he settled himself on top of his desk and started talking more like a teacher. "This is the sort of thing we'll be focusing on this year. Basic enchantments. Teaching objects to do what we want, like a door that will open and close for us, glasses that can change their tint in the sun, or a test that grades itself." He was cut off by an urgent demand. "What do the purple circles mean?" Charlie held up her paper, which was covered in them. He took the interruption in stride. "Those indicate that the answer was guessed. One of the greatest benefits of enchantment, and also the greatest challenge, is that intentions are part of the magic. And that is exactly what we'll be starting to work on this week. How to infuse letters and runes with your intentions. However, as there are only a few minutes left in class, I think it's best if we leave any actual lesson off till tomorrow and introduce you to the big project this year." He appeared to delight in the roller coaster of emotions that sentence inflicted. He had set them up with false hope of leaving early, only to be bludgeoned with a promise of a huge pile of work. "I'm sure you're all aware that part of the graduation ceremony requires you to reach the high school grounds under your own power." They did know that. They'd known it from their first day on Avalon when they watched all of the high schoolers float, fly, and climb their way up the massive butte at the center of the island, a granite pillar taller than any of the trees upon which stood Avalon High. Even so, high school had always been far away, unreachable in both time and space. Their new teacher's chipper reminder of their impending graduation made it seem suddenly much nearer. "As is traditional, your major project this year will be to independently craft your means of ascent." He raised a finger to cut off the complaints he was about to earn. "That is to say, you cannot merely buy a broom, at least not if you wish to pass. This is about you proving your skills. Show us what you've learned. Build your own broom, enchant your own wall walkers, weave a flying rug. You have all year. For now, just start thinking about what you want to create." He clasped his hands and leaned in with eager eyes in a way that made it hard not to be excited about the project. And then his gaze softened to a more sympathetic smile. "I've probably done enough to you today," he said. "Why don't you head out early?" As the class cheered and blasted for the door, Pendragon asked Kuro to stay behind. He got some pitying looks from his friends, but he brushed them aside. Being held after class, getting blamed for something he didn't do or couldn't control, not understanding a single thing Mrs. Lovelace said in numerology. It was all part of the back-to-school ritual, like a song he knew by heart. Not one he liked, but it was at least comforting in its familiarity. "I don't mean to keep you long, Kuro," Mr. Pendragon said as he perched on a nearby desk. The man seemed to have some kind of allergy to chairs. "And given the individual warnings I've got about you from every single teacher at the school, I expect you'll be surprised to learn this has nothing to do with your academics." He was. "I just want to know where you got that bracelet, if you don't mind me asking." He did. "See, I've heard of charms like those before, but I've not had the pleasure of seeing one in person." Kuro had quite enough of the friendly and casual attitude of the new teacher. If Pendragon was trying to gain his trust by appearing nonchalant, it was a poor attempt. "I didn't steal it," Kuro said. The teacher laughed at the suggestion. "I can't imagine you'd be wearing it to class if you had. Would you mind if I had a peek at the rune work on it? Academic curiosity." There wasn't much point in arguing with the teacher. At some point, he'd stop asking and start telling, and any argument past that was a path to detention. He held out his arm for the teacher to inspect the silver bangle. Pendragon held out his hand for Kuro to pass over the bracelet. They then stared at each other with equally blank expressions, waiting for the other to either yield or explain themselves. Pendragon broke first. "You don't want to take it off?" "It doesn't come off." "Why not?" "Magic." The teacher conceded to that explanation. "Well now, if that doesn't make it all the more interesting." He took the outstretched arm as an invitation and kneeled by Kuro's desk to get a closer look. After a couple moments of squinting, he pulled out a magnifying eyepiece from a pocket and peered at the intricate pattern of runes on the bracelet. The transformation from charming showman to bookish academic was startling. In the absence of an audience and with a curious object in view, Pendragon was an entirely different person. "Absolutely stunning," he said in awe as he gently rotated it. "Outstanding craftsmanship. I still don't understand why you have it. A Redcoat or Valkyrie would give their right arm for one of these." He would have been happy to give it to them, except doing so would cost Kuro's arm rather than theirs. After a few minutes, the bell marking the end of the school day rang, and the teacher reluctantly released the bracelet. He stood and stretched before saying, "I'd happily devote my whole afternoon to deciphering the runes on that, but I can't imagine that's how you'd choose to spend your day." He gave Kuro a moment to disagree, then continued in disappointment. "I shan't keep you any longer. Should you ever feel like indulging my curiosity, stop on by." Kuro left with calculated haste. He didn't want to sour the relationship with his new teacher by sprinting from the room, but neither did he want to give the man a chance to change his mind. Also, his friends had a several-minute head start on him. It would take most of the way through summer to catch up without the help of a tailwind. He bounded down the stairs, startling the new students who weren't yet comfortable with navigating the school. Depending on how the floors were counted, the building had between 4 and 17. The main staircase, despite only being 3 stories, reached all of them. The new kids clung to the railing as every step down made their stomach lurch as though the ground had been pulled out from under them. Kuro had grown so used to it that he'd forgotten it had ever been strange. Ignoring the distress he'd caused, he hurled himself out of the arched double doors at the front of the school and then tripped to a stop as he found that he'd already caught up with his friends. His entire year of classmates were out on the lawn in front of the school staring skyward. As he traced their gaze, he discovered the ultimate purpose of Pendragon's performance. They hadn't been released early as some act of generosity. He had primed them all with a healthy dose of excitement and dread, then turned them loose without diffusing it. He'd given them just enough time to get outside before the high school let out so they could watch the students leaving. At the center of the island was a granite butte, an impossibly tall column of jagged stone. Its flat top large enough to house gardens, lacrosse fields, the teacher's residence, and the fortress-like Avalon High School from which students were starting to depart. From the ground, they looked like a swarm of hornets leaving their nest, black dots against the clear blue sky. But even from that distance, the faint shapes of their transports could be discerned. Brooms and carpets made up the majority, but they were by no means the only options. Gliders and balloons drifted gently across the island. A small sailboat cruised on a river of clouds blossoming in front of it. Some students strolled casually down the side of the butte as if it were flat ground. Others just flung themselves off the edge, plummeting into the trees with absolute trust that whatever enchanted gizmo they had would arrest their descent before they became craters. Even knowing he'd been manipulated into it, Kuro was no more immune to the effects. He watched the descent of the high schoolers almost in a trance, brought on by warring impulses of trepidation and anticipation. Somehow, over the next year, he would have to transform himself from a land-bound child to a fledged wizard, and he had been given the cursed freedom to choose his own path to do so. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.